Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Hope One Live. Question: what does it mean to be pro-life? And if you're pro-life, shouldn't you be for the lockdown until no one is at risk of coronavirus? If not, wouldn't you then be trading lives for money? And how does one answer the arguments for abortion? People today are saying, well, it's my body, it's my choice. And if you're not a woman, your opinion doesn't matter. You have to trust the woman and her doctor. The government should be neutral. The government should stay out of it. And by the way, an unborn baby, they'll say, is not a person. And if you criminalize abortion, that's going to lead to back alley abortions and people are going to get hurt. And what about rape and incest? How does that factor in? And isn't it true that abortion rates are lower in countries with stricter abortion laws? Well, there are a few people better in our country to answer these questions than my friend Scott Klusendorf. Scott is the founder and the president of the Life Training Institute. He'll tell us what that's about. He's also graduated of UCLA and Biola. He's participated in debates on college campuses on this issue with Nadine Strossen, who was the president of the ACLU, and also Kathy Neer, who was the president of Planned Parenthood in California. He's debated or lectured to student groups all over the country, at high schools, at colleges, at churches. In fact, he's spoken at nearly 100 college campuses. He is extremely qualified to talk about this issue. So let's bring Scott on. Scott, how are you this morning?
Doing great, Frank. Always good to be with you.
It's always great to be with you as well, Scott. You know, you are sort of when I think of a pro-life leader out there, you're the guy I think of. How long have you been in this pro-life venue or this pro-life task that you've been on? How long have you been doing this?
30 years this November.
Wow. And how did it start? How did you get into it?
Well, here's the real short story. I had been an associate pastor at a church in Southern California. I'd always been pro-life, Frank. There was never a time in my life where if you asked me, are you pro-life, I would not have answered yes. But I wasn't lifting a finger to stopping the killing. And finally, a local pregnancy center director, Lois Cunningham, bugged me and said, I want you to come hear this speaker. So I went, and it ended up being her future husband, Greg Cunningham. He laid out a case for the pro-life view. He was a lawyer and a Justice Department official in Reagan's second term. And he laid out a case for the pro-life view, but then he did something that fundamentally changed my life. He showed a video depicting abortion. Frank, I had never seen abortion. And I sat there and I wept and I thought, I am no different than the priest and the Levite who passed by on the other side of the road. I say I care about this, but I don't act like I care about this. So I went home that day, showed my wife that VHS tape he showed. VHS tapes were these rectangular things we used to have. Ask anybody who's seen VeggieTales. But I showed her that tape and said, I think my whole life has been changed. And she said, whatever, I'm with you. And here I am. So 6 months after that day in November of 1990, I resigned my job at the church. And 30 years later, here we are doing pro-life apologetics.
Now, tell us about the Life Training Institute. How did this begin? How many people are part of this? And what do you do?
Life Training Institute trains pro-life advocates how to make a case for the pro-life view. And we do it primarily by reaching out to Catholic and Protestant high schools where we give pro-life apologetic presentations. Now, that's a little bit different, Frank, than what a lot of pro-life groups do. Many pro-life groups do very laudable work on abstinence, chastity, testimonies about abortion. We support all of that work. That's good stuff. But we have a little bit different niche. We focus on the arguments for the pro-life view, and we make the case why the pro-life position is true and reasonable to believe. And quite frankly, many of these students have never heard a rational case for the pro-life view. They've been told they ought to be pro-life because the Bible says so or because their church says so, but they aren't pro-life because they've actually embraced the moral logic of the pro-life view. So when they hear it, they're floored. And the most common response we get is a student who says, we've never heard anything like this before. So that's what we do. That's what we focus on. There's 5 of us who speak full time at LTI. We go into colleges, universities, secular forums, but mainly we love to focus on high school students at the Protestant and Catholic high schools so that we can equip them to reach their friends with pro-life truth.
You know, it sounds like just apologetics for the Christian faith. We've never heard this stuff before.
Isn't that the truth? Exactly. You know, you're battling it in the generalist sense, and we're battling it in the specialized sense.
Well, let's start at the beginning. We're going to get into the coronavirus situation, and can you be pro-life and say, gee, you know, I think this lockdown ought to end soon. And would that mean we're not being pro-life because some people may die? We're going to get into that. But let's start at the beginning, Scott. How do we know an unborn child is a human being?
Every pro-life advocate watching us right now, Frank, needs to begin their argument with a syllogism. And that sounds like a big word, but a syllogism simply means a couple of premises and a conclusion that hopefully follows from those premises. Here is your pro-life syllogism. Premise 1, it's wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. Premise 2, abortion intentionally kills an innocent human being. Conclusion, therefore abortion is wrong. It's wrong to intentionally kill innocent human beings. Abortion does that, therefore it's wrong. Now, why do I say that we have to start there even before we discuss when does life begins? Here's why. Because if you don't anchor your argument in a stated syllogism, people will change the subject on you. They'll talk about choice and who decides. They'll talk about rape and incest. They'll talk about back alley abortions, all of which we'll get to. But when you have a clearly defined syllogism you're arguing from, you only have to ask one question when you hear an objection. Does this objection refute my syllogism? If the answer is no, they're changing the subject on you. Now, we defend that syllogism with science and philosophy. We argue from science that from the earliest stages of development, you, Frank, were a distinct, living, and whole human being. You weren't part of another human being like skin cells on the back of my hand. You were already a whole living member of the human family, even though you had yet to grow and mature. And every credible embryology textbook in the universe is going to back me up on that statement. Sure, they may enter into philosophical discussions on whether they think that life has value at that stage, but as to the kind of thing it is, that debate has been settled. Then pro-lifers argue philosophically that there's no essential difference between you, the unborn, and you, the adult, that would justify killing you at that earlier stage of development. So that's our argument in what is in essence a minute defense of the pro-life position.
Hey, before we go any further, I want people out there who are watching right now that if you've had an abortion or contributed to an abortion, don't go away. We have a solution for you. Okay, I just want everyone to know that right now. Don't shut this off. Scott, I hear people making the case that, okay, they may admit, in fact, there have been pro-abortion people, feminists admitting it's a human being, but they try and say it's not a person. So first of all, give us evidence it's a human being. And secondly, that it is a person, if that matters at all.
Yeah. Well, the scientific case for the humanity of the unborn, again, is not a religious claim. It's a scientific claim grounded in the science of embryology. And people will bring up objections. They'll say, well, how can you say that's a distinct living whole human being when twinning can occur? After all, that embryo can split into two up to 21 days post-fertilization. So how can you claim we have a distinct whole living being from the very beginning? And of course, my question is, how does it follow that because a living thing splits, that it wasn't a whole living human being prior to the split? If you slice a flatworm in half, you get two flatworms. Does it follow there was no flatworm prior to the split? So the twinning objection doesn't refute the scientific case that we see in embryology textbooks worldwide. Other people will say, well, women don't grieve miscarriages the way they grieve the death of a toddler or a teenager or an older child. And Frank, you and I both know women who grieve deeply miscarriages. In fact, any of our listeners that are watching right now, and if you've suffered that, you know what I'm saying is true. But just for a moment, let me just bracket that for a moment. How do my feelings about something change what it is? If I got a text message after this show indicating one of my own children has died, I'd feel worse about that than reading about 500 kids who die in India today from malnutrition. but it wouldn't follow that my own kids are more valuable and human
Mm.
than those in India. So my feelings about something don't change. So the science is clear. The unborn are distinct, living, and whole human beings. But what about those who say, okay, it's human, but it's not a person? Well, I always have a quick question. What's the difference? Have
Right.
you ever met a human that wasn't a person? Now,
Mm.
viewers that have teenagers, you might be saying, yeah, actually, I have that in my house right now. But
Uh-huh.
the rest of us, the truth is, why should anyone believe there can be such a thing as a human being that's not a person? And Frank, as you know, those who make that claim are assuming a worldview known as body self dualism. It says that my body exists over here, but my real self is totally disconnected from my body, and my body isn't the real me. The real me is my self awareness, my ability to feel pain, my thoughts, my interactions, my cognitive abilities, basically. And until I have those, I may be human, but I'm not a person. Well, that worldview is frightening when you stop to think about it, because it grounds human value in something completely subjective. Whatever the authorities decide is the decisive factor, that's what will give me a right to life. So let's say we pick self awareness. Well, if you've had more coffee than I have this morning, Frank, and you're more self aware than I am, then by that logic, you are more of a person than I am, and hence have a greater right to life. But there's a host of problems with body self dualism, but that's the biggest. It can't account for human equality. It's much better to ground human equality in the objective fact of our biological humanity.
Scott, you've developed kind of an acronym. We call it the SLED argument. Everyone who teaches at Summit, you teach at Summit, I teach at Summit. We learned all this from you. What is the SLED argument or the SLED acronym, and how can it help people present the pro-life case to others?
Well, to give credit where credit is due, I first read of the SLED acronym from Stephen Schwartz in his excellent book, The Moral Question of Abortion. But so as not to credit him with something he may not like, I did modify it slightly.
All
But
right.
basically, what the SLED acronym says is this: there is no essential difference between you, the embryo, and you, the adult, that would justify killing you back then. Differences of size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency, think of the acronym SLED, and
Mm-hmm.
you'll remember those four differences, are not good reasons for saying we could kill you then, but not now. And here's why that matters, Frank. Pro-lifers have a tendency to think that every time a critic raises a difference between you, the embryo, and you, the adult, that somehow they've raise something significant. Of course, there's differences between you, the embryo, and you, the adult, but that's not the question. The
Mm.
question is, are those differences significant such that we could say we could kill you then, but not now?
Mm.
Size, you were smaller as an embryo. You know what your answer should be when you hear that?
Mm.
So, how does body
Mm.
size determine value? Men are generally larger than women. We don't think men deserve more rights than women simply because they're larger. Or
Mm.
we don't think Shaquille O'Neal, the former basketball star who was 7'2", is more human and valuable than all of us because he's a foot taller than most people watching right now. Body size doesn't give you value. Level of development, there's your L in that SLED acronym. You were less developed as an embryo. So, why does being developed matter in the first place? That's the question our critics need to answer. It's not enough to just assert a difference. Tell me why that matters. 2-year-olds are less developed than 21-year-olds. 2-year-old girls do not have a developed reproductive system yet. Are they less human and valuable than the 21-year-old young woman who does? Uh, any listeners that are watching right now, if you're under 25, I have bad news for you. You are less developed than your parents. You're less developed than your parents physically, and you're less developed than your parents intellectually, though that may come as a shock to some of you. But the fact is, you're not going to reach your intellectual peak till your mid 40s. Are you
Uh-huh.
less human and valuable because of it? What
Mm.
about environment, where you're located? You were in the womb, now you're out. How does where you are determine what you are? In other
Mm.
words, if driving to work, let's say you drive, once the shutdown is lifted, you drive 7 miles to work. Does a journey of 7 miles change you from one kind of thing to another? If not, How does a journey of 7 inches down the birth canal suddenly transform you from a non-human, non-valuable thing we can kill to a valuable human being that we can't? And finally, D, degree of dependency. Sure, you depended on your mother for survival, but since when does dependency on another human being mean that we can kill you? There
Mm,
are twins, conjoined twins that are born that depend on each other's bodily systems for survival. Do we kill both twins because neither can live without the other? There are
mm.
children born that cannot tolerate or they can't tolerate formula. They can only tolerate their own mother's milk. Do we think it's okay for a mother to say to her child, tough luck, you depend on me for survival, my body, my choice, too bad, and disconnect the kid? So if you look at these 4 differences, size, level of development, environment, degree of dependency, none of them are good reasons for saying we could kill you then, but not now.
Yeah, it's the old viability argument too with dependency. Well, we should allow abortion until viability. Well, even first of all, that's arbitrary, and it keeps being moved back by modern science. But even a fully formed baby isn't viable once you get out of the womb. They got to be taken care of by some. Most teenagers aren't viable. Scott. I mean, come on, you
Yeah.
leave them alone, they're going
You
to
heard
die.
about the pajama boy? Yeah, really. Well, here's the thing. There's devastating counterexamples that work against the
Yeah,
viability argument. So here's one. A woman is 21 weeks pregnant, which in a modern hospital in New York City today, or LA or San Francisco, gives the child a fighting chance if he were born prematurely at roughly that point.
right.
She gets on a plane in New York where her 21-week fetus is viable and hence a person, according to this argument. The woman then flies to Bangladesh, where viability isn't till 28 weeks. And then
Mm,
she flies back home, where viability is again 21 weeks. Does her child go from being briefly human in New York, where
mhm,
it can be born at 21 weeks, be viable, to being non viable when it enters Bangladesh airspace, back to being viable again when it gets into
mm.
American airspace? I mean, these are the absurd consequences of these arguments.
Friends, we're going to get to your questions in about 15 or 20 minutes once we're done with our discussion here. So if you have a question for Scott Klusendorf of the Life Training Institute, type the word question in big block capital letters. Make sure your question is succinct in complete English, and we'll try and get to them a little bit later. Scott, let's do a little bit of lightning round here if we can. Give us as brief a comeback or an answer as you can to some of the objections you hear or some of the justifications you hear for abortion. I'm just going to go through them, and we'll see what you say. Okay, it's my body, my choice.
Okay, well, first of all, if the fetus is part of the mother's body, that means the unborn has 4 arms, 4 eyes, 4 legs. And if it's a male child, the mother also has something else, which we won't get into here for fear of venturing into R-rated territory. So we know conclusively it's not part of the mother's body. Typically, what the critic means is, well, I have sovereign control over my body. Well, if that's the case, then a mother who takes thalidomide during pregnancy, which causes children to be born with no arms and no legs, if she takes that to mitigate her morning sickness, even though her physician tells her don't do it, she's done nothing wrong. After all, it's her body, her choice. If that's the argument, there can be no restrictions on abortion. It must be allowed for any reason or no reason, and you can't even object to late-term abortion.
Well, a lot of people now don't. Governor Cuomo and many others in the Democrat Party are now celebrating abortion, Scott, at full term. I mean,
Right.
this is unconscionable. I don't know, who is it? Governor Northam, what's his name up there in Virginia, was even saying after the baby's born, I don't know if we'll keep it alive or not.
Right. Yeah, New York, the New York law strips protections from unborn children who survive abortion procedures. The Virginia law does basically the same thing. And the Illinois law explicitly states the unborn are not human persons that deserve protection. So you're right. The Democrat Party is absolutely committed to the proposition that an entire class of human beings can be set aside to be killed.
I remember Bill Clinton 25 years ago saying, we want abortion to be safe, legal, and rare. They don't even use that terminology anymore. They want to shout
No.
abortions. What's going on with this, Scott?
Well, here's what happened. Yeah, here's what happened. Safe, legal, and rare ran into a real problem because the obvious question is, why should it be rare? If
Yeah, right.
abortion is morally not objectionable, who cares how many there are?
Hmm.
And so they decided, you know what, that's indefensible. We can't go there anymore. So now it's just a matter of abortion on demand without apology. And if you don't like it, we're not even going to try to argue against you. We're just going to cancel you. We're going to put you in the category of those we can just cancel. And that's why you see on university campuses pro-abortionists not wanting to debate pro-life advocates. Rather, they just want to shout them down and cancel the presentation, which is why, by the way, I do appreciate my friend Nadine Strawson, former president of the ACLU. Look, she's wrong on abortion, but she's a free speech advocate, and I got to hand it to her. She defends the right of people like me to make our case, and that I can appreciate. I wish everybody were like that.
Yeah, she debated you. She debated Mike Adams and others. So
Yeah,
uh, kudos to her for at least allowing
absolutely.
free speech. It's incredible that when people can't support their position, suddenly they don't want to talk about it anymore.
Right.
At least Dean will do it. That's good for her on that point. Another objection. You hear this: if you're not a woman, your opinion doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's so funny how often I hear men say that. So why are they offering their opinion? Their argument is literally self-defeating. But look, if no man can speak on abortion, we need to overturn Roe v. Wade because it was decided by 9 men. And of course, no one wants to go there. I think my friend Frank Beckwith puts it well. Arguments don't have gender, people do. And pro-life women use the same arguments I use, which means you've got to refute our argument, not change the subject and attack us personally. This is called the ad hominem fallacy.
Mhm.
And this is why, Frank, I began by saying we've got to start with a syllogism. Because when someone says, well, you're a man, well, maybe I am. How does that refute the argument I made? My
Mhm.
argument is not based on gender, it's based on whether the premises are sound and the conclusion follows. If you cannot show that I go wrong on one of those 2 points, then I'm not obliged to give up my opinion just because I'm a man.
Yeah, it seems like that same argument too, Scott, could be used to say if you're not a white slave owner, you should have no opinion on slavery,
Or
right?
only generals get to discuss the morality of war.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are very silly arguments.
How about trust the woman and her doctor, keep the government neutral? Is the government really neutral here, Scott?
Well, people love to say they want the government out of this. And my first question is, do you mean the federal courts? Because the federal courts are very much involved in abortion. In
Mhm.
fact, in Roe v. Wade, here's what happened. The court did not take government out of the abortion decision. It just asserted that only one branch of the federal government gets a say in it, namely the federal courts. And the
Hmm.
federal courts in Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton basically say that the legislative and executive branches of government have no say in this issue. Only the federal courts get a say in this issue. Well, that's
Hmm.
not getting government out of the issue. By the way, notice the argument assumes the unborn are not human.
Yeah.
Nobody would argue that we ought to get the government out of protecting toddlers. They only
Hmm.
want to get the government out of protecting fetuses. Why? Because they assume the unborn are not human. They haven't argued for it, they just assume it.
Hmm. How about criminalizing abortion will lead to back alley abortions? You hear that a lot.
Yeah, you do. Now, look, all pro lifers, in fact, all of us, feel pity. We feel sadness for any woman who dies from an abortion, legal or illegal. But notice again that this argument assumes the unborn aren't human, because otherwise, what you're arguing is that because some people die attempting to intentionally kill other innocent human beings, we ought to make it safe and legal for them to intentionally kill other innocent human beings. But why should the law be faulted, Frank, for making it more risky for one person to intentionally kill another completely innocent one? We don't legalize bank robbery to make it safer for
Hmm.
felons.
Hmm.
That, and the statistical data is clear. Women did not die by 5 to 10,000 a year from illegal abortion. That's a myth. And I'll just very quickly cite 2 pro-abortion sources, not pro-life sources. Pro-abortion source number 1, Mary Calderon, former medical director for Planned Parenthood. She said in 1960, when allegedly all these illegal abortions were happening, that the death rate from illegal abortion was so low it wasn't even worth commenting on because penicillin had made all surgical procedures safe. Second source, Dr. Bernard Nathanson, in his book, Aborting America, he was a co-founder of NARAL, National Abortion Rights Action League. He argued in there that when he and his colleagues started NARAL, they intentionally lied to the media about the deaths. They invented that number of 5 to 10,000 a year out of thin air. There was no support for it, and the media bought it hook, line, and sinker.
And they continue to buy it. We wrote about that 20 years ago in our book, Legislating Morality. Dr. Geisler and I, we invest same thing. The guy said it was just a convenient number we made up. How about rape and incest? How about rape and incest? You hear this all the time, Scott. Well, this is the hard problem. What do we do about rape and incest? What do you say?
Two types of people bring up rape and incest: the crusaders and the inquirers. The inquirers are intellectually honest. They hear our pro-life argument, they hear our syllogism, and they're getting it. But they just have this emotional hurdle of thinking of maybe their daughter or sibling getting raped and saying, how can I force her to give birth when she's undergone this? Right. And for the inquirer, you're going to be very gentle. And here's the question you put to them. Given you and I agree that this woman who has been sexually assaulted has suffered a horrendous injustice, we agree on that. You're right. Mm-hmm. Given we agree on that, how should a civil society treat innocent human beings who remind us of a painful event? And just let the question be there a minute. And then say, is it okay to intentionally kill them so we can feel better? Pro-lifers tend to right away go to statistics. Well, most women who get raped don't get pregnant. Okay, that may be true, but that's the wrong answer at that moment. Show some empathy and then show that the real issue here is not rape, it's what is the unborn. Nobody suggests killing a 2-year-old if it will make his mother feel better and help her forget what happened to her when she was assaulted. They only argue about doing that with the unborn. Why? Because they assume the unborn aren't human. Now, the crusader, he doesn't want a logical argument. He's just trying to make you look bad by raising this objection. So call his bluff. Say, okay, I'm going to grant for the sake of argument that we allow abortion in cases of rape. It's not my position, but let's grant it for the sake of discussion. Will you now join me in opposing all other abortions that have nothing to do with rape? And of course, immediately he's going to backpedal. No, women have a fundamental right to an abortion. Okay, if that's true, it can never be infringed on. You cannot infringe on fundamental rights. That means she can have an abortion for any reason she wants through all 9 months of pregnancy. You need to defend that position rather than hiding behind rape victims.
Yeah, I've heard Frank Beckwith, our mutual friend, say, why do you even bring it up? Because rape and incest are hard issues, but if you go to them, like you just said, and say, okay, let's just for political purposes say we're going to allow those. That was George W. Bush's position, by the way. Would you join me and say, let's get rid of all the other convenience abortions? He's going to say no. So why do you even bring up rape and incest? It doesn't do anything for your case.
No, it does nothing for the pro-choice argument, because the pro-choice argument is that any woman at any point in pregnancy, for any reason she wants, can kill her unborn child. The argument from rape would only justify rape abortions. As Frank is apt to say, that's kind of like saying we should get rid of all traffic laws because you might have to run a red light rushing a loved one to the hospital.
Right, exactly. How about this? Somebody just emailed me this the other day. He tends to be somebody who's he doesn't like the Republicans on so many issues, and he knows that the Democrats are awful, particularly on abortion and marriage and these other things. He's trying to find a way, I think, to support the Democrats. So he asked the question based on an article that NBC News published a couple of years ago. Apparently, the article said that abortion rates are lower in countries with stricter abortion laws. Now, that seems totally counterintuitive to me, Scott. It would seem to me that, like, if you said we're going to lift all restrictions on murder and rape and theft, we'd get a lot more of that. So, why would anyone say such a thing, that abortion rates are lower in places that have stricter abortion laws?
Well, first of all, we know it's not true here in America, and here's why. The most liberal estimates for illegal abortion prior to Roe v. Wade in 1973 were that there were roughly 210,000 illegal abortions a year. Within 5 years of legalization in this country, we jumped to 1.6 million a year. So instead of comparing apples with oranges, let's compare like with like. What we need to ask is what will happen to abortion rates here in the US if abortion is made illegal? And I know the answer to that. They're going to go down. Will some women still have illegal abortions? Of course. Outlawing rape doesn't end all rape, but nobody would suggest that we legalize rape, as you said, because, well, it's not going to make any difference about what the rates are. Yes, it will. And we know for a fact that when we legalized abortion, it went up. The second thing I would point out is that the studies that people bring up saying that criminalizing abortion doesn't do anything to make the rates go down, most of those studies look at obscure countries in third world locations. They're not looking at Western republics like the United States. And if you look at the US and you compare abortion rates from 1980 to now, you see quite a drop in the number of abortions annually. In fact, we went from 1.6 million to where now the estimates are about around 850,000 a year instead of 1.6 million. Well, during that time, many states have passed what's called abortion control legislation that limits the evil of abortion. And as scientist Michael New has pointed out, he's a statistics guy. He says, listen, this abortion control legislation has had an impact on lowering the rate. We can show a very strong correlation between these laws and rates going down. So I think those who raise that objection you just mentioned aren't digging deep enough in their research. And the primary problem is they're comparing apples with oranges and then saying that's what's going to happen here.
Also, you hear people today saying more and more, well, you're just pro-life up to birth. What about being pro-life all the way, from womb to the tomb? You got to be for all these government programs that we say are going to support life once it's here. What do you say to that?
Is the American Cancer Society negligent in its medical duties because it treats one disease and not all of them? Would anybody criticize a Christian daycare ministry that opened up in the inner city of Philadelphia and they only saw children from 3 to 5 school days to give inner city moms a little time to get home from work and get dinner going? Would anybody say to that ministry, why aren't you open 24/7? You only care about kids after school. And what are you doing about gang violence? What are you doing about drug abuse in the city? What are you doing about inner city poverty? Why, you're not helping these kids. If you really were, you'd care for all children of all ages and you'd do it around the clock 24/7, but you don't. Nobody would say that to that ministry. But they do to pro-lifers, and it's absurd, and I refuse to stand for it. How does it follow, Frank, that because I oppose the intentional killing of an innocent human being, I have to take responsibility for fixing everything wrong with society? That is simply absurd. Now, as Christians, will we have a broader ethic that embraces a lot of issues? Of course. But it doesn't follow that the operational objectives of the pro-life movement have to be broad and inclusive as well. Frederick the Great put it well. He who attacks everywhere attacks nowhere. If you want to bankrupt a movement, make it holistic rather than specific, and you will immediately run into that problem.
But they're trying to say, I know there's some Christians who are trying to support people who are pro-abortion, but they're trying, Scott, to say, but I'm really pro-life. Okay, yeah, I'm voting for this guy even though he's pro-abortion, but he's got all these government programs that are going to help people after they're born. Why?
Yeah,
what do you say to that?
Yeah, people forget that we need to make a distinction between intrinsic evils and contingent ones. For example, war is a contingent evil. It may be wrong if our cause isn't just. Capital punishment is a contingent evil. It may be wrong if we've wrongly convicted someone. But then there are other evils that are intrinsic, meaning they're wrong on the face of it. And intentionally killing innocent human beings is wrong on the face of it, and any law permitting it is scandalous. And what a lot of leftists want to do is muddy the political waters. They say, well, this candidate over here, this Democrat candidate over here, he's actually more pro-life than the candidate who's anti-abortion because he's, okay, this Democrat's wrong on abortion, but he's right on capital punishment, he's right on war, he's right on poverty. The problem is you can't put all these issues together in one big moral stew and treat them as morally equivalent. An intentional killing of an innocent human being is an intrinsic evil, and it isn't on the same level as denying somebody a lunch with a federal program. You've got to segregate these issues out, and people don't do that.
And you can be pro-life and be for the lunch program. We're not saying you can't be. We're just saying they're not on the same level.
That's correct.
Well, let's jump in the last few minutes we have before questions from our audience. And again, friends, if you want to ask questions of Scott Klusendorf, all you need to do is type the word question in big block letters, capital letters. Make it clear, succinct, complete English, YouTube feed, Facebook feed. Scott, I got to ask you this because you just came out with an article on the Christian Research Journal on this, and this is a hot topic right now. In fact, it's the topic of that we have here on the lower thirds of the screen. Must pro-life people be for the coronavirus lockdown until there's absolutely no risk? Because wouldn't we be trading lives for money then if we say that?
Well, pro-lifers are not trading lives for money if they oppose perpetual shutdown of the economy. We're not saying that lives are less important than money. We're looking at what will happen if you shut down this nation's economy. Will more lives be lost doing that than would be lost if we keep the shutdown going? The reality is, or open it up rather. The reality is that no pro-lifer thinks we should trade lives for money. But we recognize that our true argument must always be kept in focus. And let's go back to what that argument is. We began the show with it. It is always wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. That principle is non-negotiable, even if it helps, even if killing an innocent human being would help us get over a pandemic like COVID-19. And that is why 2 weeks ago, when Democrats tried to pressure the Trump administration into funding destructive fetal tissue research that the Democrats said would help us find a cure for COVID-19, pro-lifers opposed that and said, no, you cannot intentionally kill an innocent human being to help others. You must never do that. And we stood firm against that. But there are cases, Frank, where we don't intend the death of an innocent human being, but we can foresee it. And we allow that trade-off for the sake of other intrinsic goods. For example, if we must never put lives at risk while thinking of profits, you and I can never drive to work each day because there's always a chance we'll be killed or kill someone while driving our car. If we really care only about saving lives, there should be a worldwide speed limit of only 25 miles per hour because 1.5 million people a year worldwide get killed in auto wrecks. But we don't do that. Why? Because although we don't intend anybody to die in an auto wreck, we recognize that in the pursuit of other intrinsic goods, like getting medicine where it needs to go, getting food where it needs to go, getting products and services to people who need them, we can foresee death and injury, but we don't intend it. With abortion, with destructive fetal tissue research, we intend the deaths of innocent human beings. So by opening up the economy, and making sure we don't see catastrophic loss of life and loss of income and loss of food supply. We open up the economy not because we intend for anybody to die. We can foresee in doing that no matter where we open the economy up, now or 10 weeks from now, there'll always be a chance some innocent people will die, but we do not intend their deaths. We foresee it, but we don't intend it. And we recognize that if we fail to open up the economy, there's a real good chance we'll lose more lives and have greater catastrophic result than if we somehow just decide, okay, we're going to leave it shut until there's no risk of losing human lives.
As Jorge comes on to ask some questions, let's just expand that answer a little bit more, Scott. How could people die, more people die, if we keep the lockdown too long and too strict than if we lift it?
Well, it's interesting. The United Nations 2 days ago published an article, a story saying that they fear that there could be hundreds of thousands of children who die worldwide due to the economic downturn that we are facing right now. Suicides go up in economic downturns. 40,000 Americans, most of them men, took their lives during the Great Depression. A major study done in the Yale School of Law and Medicine came to the conclusion that economic prosperity and employment was the single greatest factor contributing to longevity of life, and unemployment and economic downturns put humans at risk for a lot of diseases they don't get if they can stay healthy working. So there's a lot of empirical evidence I talk about in the article that I published at Christian Research Journal, which people can get today at equip.org. And that article, and maybe you've linked to it on your site, Frank, but there's a lot of empirical evidence pointing to the fact that when you shut down an economy, you also put lives at risk. Mm-hmm. So to say that pro-lifers are willing to throw granny under the bus to save their 401ks is a very unfair way to characterize this debate. You can be a principled pro-life person and still make a very compelling argument. The best we can do, given the pandemic we've been dealt, is open up the economy. That is not a compromise of pro-life principles. That's a prudential discussion people of goodwill can have different views on, but we shouldn't demonize someone who thinks we ought to open up the economy.
Given what we see around the country, certain areas will open up before others. That's quite obvious. You don't need to lock down Montana because Manhattan has a bigger problem. So, yeah. And we'll talk more about that as the week unfolds. We'll have Dr. Dan Eichenberger on tomorrow to talk about the medical effects of this. But let's go to questions, Scott. We got a lot of people that have questions. So Jorge is here to throw you some questions from our audience. Go right ahead.
Hey, fellas. First, thank everybody watching all across of our platforms. We have hundreds of people tuning in. First question, Sam. If someone is a Christian and claims to be pro-choice, how would you go about using the Bible to help the pro-choice individual reconsider?
Yeah, if the pro-choice person accepts biblical authority, and again, my answer assumes they do based on the question, here's what I would say. Do you believe each and every human being bears the image of God, as Scripture teaches? And Scripture teaches that clearly, Old Testament and New Testament. And I would simply say, do you believe each and every human being equally bears the image of God? When they say yes, and they must, then I simply say, if I can demonstrate to you from the science of embryology that the unborn are indeed human beings every bit as much as we are, would you then agree that they too bear the image of God and we should not intentionally kill them? Now, at that point, they're going to have a real hard time getting out of that vice that I've just set for them. Once you deny that each and every human being equally bears the image of God, you are at that point campaigning for human inequality, not human equality. So I think framing this debate around the question, does each and every human being equally bear the image of God? That's the way to go. I don't think running to Psalm 139 is the best way to go biblically, or Jeremiah 1:5. I'd rather just keep the main thing. All humans have value because they bear the image of God. Because they bear the image of God, the shedding of innocent blood is strictly forbidden. Abortion is the shedding of innocent blood. Therefore, abortion does not line up with a biblical worldview. And that's where I would go.
Yeah. You know, Scott, I've heard our mutual friend Greg Kokel talk about this issue from Luke chapter 1 about the babe leaping in the womb. Have you ever thought about using that position?
Yeah, that is actually one way to go if you want direct biblical evidence that I think is very plausible, and to say, listen, you know the story. Mary's pregnant, Elizabeth is pregnant. They meet, and the babe in Elizabeth's womb leaps when the baby Jesus shows up. I've heard critics try to dismiss this, but I think clearly that points to there being a human that bears the image of his maker, even in the womb.
Yeah, great. Randy Grimes says, will you discuss what would happen to all of the children that are not aborted? Foster care is beyond a breaking point. The church is not stepping up to foster or adopt. This is a church issue. Could it be that things will not change until the church does what it is commanded to do? How you answer that?
Well, first of all, I don't believe that Christians, by and large, are sitting on their hands refusing to adopt children. There's a lot of red tape that gets in the way. That's why you read about friends on social media who travel to Russia and China trying to get children. Why aren't they taking them here? Because the red tape is horrendous and they have trouble. But notice how that objection that the foster care system is full, and if someone were to argue from that abortion ought to be okay because the foster system is full, notice that they're assuming the unborn aren't human. Should we kill 2-year-olds because no one will adopt them by age 5? Well, of course not. You only argue that way with the human fetus if you assume it's not a member of the human family like we are. The homeless are unwanted, but that does not justify killing them. Now, as far as the church's responsibility, yes, the church should be the most pro-adoption group anywhere. Why? Because every one of us is sinful human beings. And if you've had an abortion, listen to what I'm about to tell you. Every one of us tuned in right now have committed sin against our Maker. We've rebelled against our Maker. Not all sins are equal, but we are all cosmic rebels. And God would have been justified just being done with us, sends Jesus to bear in full the judgment every one of us right now deserves. And if we trust in Jesus alone for salvation, the great news is God the Father is no longer our judge. He's our dad, and we get adopted into his family as dearly loved children. And oh, by the way, God the Father proved that Christ's sacrifice was sufficient for your sin and mine because he raised Jesus from the dead. That's the great news of the gospel. And so, yes, we should be pro-adoption because we've been adopted into God's family, not based on anything we have done, but solely because Jesus stood in our place condemned, bearing the judgment we deserve. And if God was willing to adopt us into his family, of course, we must be pro-adoption. So I'm all for that, but I think most Christians are, and I think the biggest hurdle is many of them run into a lot of red tape.
Yeah,
Scott,
excellent.
Scott, before I forget, tell people about your book. You do have a book that deals with these issues.
Yeah, it's called The Case for Life. It's published by Crossway. The Case for Life, you can get that at Amazon. The Case for Life, Equipping Christians to Engage the Culture.
We'll put a link in the description. I got one. This one is a great segue. Where are the resources to heal even decades after having an abortion?
Oh, that's such a great question. And you know what? Millions of Americans, including a lot of people we go to church with on Sundays, are sitting there and they feel disqualified that somehow God can never use them for ministry because there's a ghost of a child in their past. And I want to tell you something. If the Apostle Paul, who wrote 2/3 of our New Testament, could be used of God despite murdering Christians, there is hope for you. And so if you're one of those precious souls that is suffering today, I want you to know that your worth to God and your ministry on his behalf is not based on what you do. You and I don't have anything good to bring to the table here. It's based on what Christ did as your representative. So some books that might really help here and might help point you the right way. In my book, The Case for Life, I deal very distinctly, a whole chapter is dedicated to post-abortion healing. I would encourage you to take a look at that book, and I go through the biblical case for having confidence that God the Father accepts you based on what Jesus did as your representative.
Great. Joshua asks, how can we be more effective in changing the cultural perception of abortion? How can we get pro-life media out?
Well, in order to change how people think about abortion, oftentimes it's important to change how they feel as a predicate to changing how they think. And that's why when we do pro-life apologetics presentations in schools and churches and worldview forums, we use a short video clip that graphically depicts abortion. And I think, Frank, you've used it in some of your talks as well. A 55-second clip that changes how people feel about the issue as a predicate to changing how they think. And of course, we're careful how we use it. We don't spring it on people without warning. But that breaks people's hearts over abortion. That's a predicate to changing how they think and ultimately behave. And I think where the pro-life movement has made a mistake is they have been shouting conclusions to people rather than establishing facts. Holding a sign that says abortion kills children is stating a conclusion. showing a picture of abortion is not just stating a conclusion, it's establishing a fact of what abortion actually does. And there are millions of our fellow citizens who are not going to change their minds until their hearts are broken on this issue, and showing them abortion is one of the most effective ways to do that.
I have a friend by the name of Don Blythe. I don't know if you know him, Scott,
Yes,
but
good
he's
guy.
he's up in the Stockton, California area, and I've been with him to abortion clinics, and he'll hold up pictures.
Yeah.
And people are broken by the pictures. He'll go to college campuses and hold up pictures, and it starts conversations, because a picture can communicate what maybe a syllogism is. That's a little bit sterile, but a picture, you see it, and
That's
you know
right.
that it's wrong immediately. Yeah,
you're exactly right. In fact, we all have taken our kids to see movies like Schindler's List, The Passion of the Christ, Hacksaw Ridge, Saving Private Ryan. Why? Not because we're trying to manipulate them emotionally, but because those images convey truths words are powerless to convey. And the abortion Holocaust is no different.
Yeah. Great. I got another question here, and it's very important. But before I get to that, I want to tell Megan and everybody who might be wondering this about the 30% off for logos. It still applies until Wednesday at midnight. So that ticker on the bottom of the screen is correct. You still can get it until Wednesday night. Go to the same page. Now, Scott, what about abortion in case of a pregnancy that could probably kill the mother during labor?
Yeah, great question. Let's go back to our syllogism. And again, this is just another reason why we've got to keep the main thing. It's wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. Abortion does that, therefore it's wrong. Let me give you an exact case that presents a real threat to the mother's life, and that's ectopic pregnancy. This is where the embryo implants on the inner wall of the fallopian tube, that narrow tube leading to the uterine cavity, and instead of implanting on the wall of the chorionic cavity, that embryo is there in that narrow tube. As that embryo grows in that narrow tube, we can all see immediately the danger to the mother. That tube could burst as the embryo grows, the mother hemorrhages to death, you lose the mother and you lose the child. So you're a pro-life doctor. What do you do with an ectopic pregnancy like I just described? Do you do nothing and let two humans die? Or do you act in such a way that you save one life, even though the foreseen but unintended result is the death of the embryo? And the answer is, I'm act to save the one life I can save. I can't save the mother. I can save the mother. I can't save her child. So I'm going to act to save the mother. Now someone says, well, that's no different than abortion. Wait a minute. Let's go back to our syllogism. It's wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. Is that what we're doing here? No, we're acting to save the mother. We foresee the death of the embryo, who will die anyway, but we don't intend his death. A general in a just war can foresee the deaths of innocent human beings, civilians, but he doesn't intend them the way Hitler did when he bombed central London during the Blitz. So again, that distinction between foreseeing the death of an innocent human being and intending it is vitally important to keep in mind.
Yeah. Teresa James Daly asks, well, how many lives are taken by abortion versus how many lives have been lost to COVID-19 within the similar time frame?
I'm going to guess that we've probably had 300,000 abortions in the first quarter of 2020. And right now, the national death from COVID-19 is a little over 40,000. I would just make one cautionary note here. I try not to hijack other tragedies by bringing abortion into it to talk about how abortion is worse. And I don't think that's what your caller was doing. But I do think we need to be very careful that we don't turn people off by saying, well, yeah, COVID-19 is bad, but abortion's worse. Listen, anybody that's lost a family member to COVID-19, that is an unmitigated tragedy. It's horrific. It's heartbreaking. And I don't want to downplay that. So yes, abortion's a very serious thing. And 800,000 to 900,000 of them a year in the U.S. is a very serious thing. But I think as pro-lifers, we want to be careful we don't unduly cause people to be offended by our position.
You know, Scott, it struck me that we could probably open the churches in some of these democratic states if we just put a Planned Parenthood sign out front, because then it would be an essential business, you know?
Actually, I went out without a mask and they asked me, why are you doing? I said, my body, my choice, baby.
Yeah, sometimes you got to throw it right back at them. Yeah.
This one, and it's delicate because of the ethical thing here, but how can anybody who claims to be pro-abortion be against the death penalty?
Well, you're right. The sword cuts both ways. People sometimes say to the pro-lifer, wait a minute, you're inconsistent. You're against abortion, but you're for the death penalty. That makes you inconsistent. Well, suppose it did. How would that invalidate the syllogism that I laid out, that it's wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being? Abortion does that, therefore it's wrong. Even if I were inconsistent, it wouldn't refute my syllogism. It would just show that I'm not being consistent in how I apply it. Now, I don't think I am being inconsistent, but it's important that we at least make that observation up front. Capital punishment, again, comes down to a contingent evil versus an intrinsic one. Abortion is an intrinsic evil because we're intentionally killing an innocent human being. Capital punishment, by definition, is not intentionally killing an innocent human being. It's killing a guilty human being. So the two are not parallel. Now, capital punishment may be wrong for other reasons, and we're not even going into that today. I'm just addressing the consistency issue here. But the main thing to keep in mind is, even if I were inconsistent, it would not refute my syllogism that it's wrong to intentionally kill innocent human beings, and abortion does that. Therefore, it's wrong.
All right, one last one, and then I'll give it back to Frank. Frisk asks, what is the difference between your book, The Case for Life, and your other book, Stand for Life?
Yeah, Case for Life is going to be more thorough, and I cover material in there that we don't get into in Stand for Life. There's a greater theological explanation on the Bible and pro-life in The Case for Life. Some of the objections get a more fuller treatment in The Case for Life. And I also have a more lengthy treatment of the problem of relativism and postmodern thinking in the abortion debate than I get into in the Stand for Life book. The Stand for Life book is a great introductory book to get people up to speed on the moral logic. It's wonderful for students. I would say any student, 9th grade and up, can follow that. And I think my co-author, John Enzer, does a fantastic job adding some theological principles as well. So it's an excellent book.
Quick question before we end, Scott. A couple of them. First question is, I noticed that many people who are pro-abortion are atheists. Do you ever, when you're dialoguing with them, ever ask them where they get this concept of rights from if there is no God? I mean, everything would just be a preference if there's no God. Do you ever get into any interaction with these people, either Nadine or others? They're talking they have no right to abortion. Where does this come from?
Yeah, exactly right. In fact, I make heavy use of your book, Stealing from God, and I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, where you bring that principle out in both of those works. When people say to me, well, women have a right to an abortion, my first question is, where does that right come from? Well, it comes from the state. The Supreme Court says she has that right. Okay, great. The same court that gave her that right can take it away. Now what? Well, she has a fundamental right to an abortion. Where does that come from? There's no way to argue for fundamental rights that transcend the state without assuming a transcendent source, without assuming a moral law giver. And so at that point, we're pointing to, you know who at that point. So yes, I do point this out. And I also point out that really on atheism, nothing has a right to life and nothing has intrinsic value. Look, in a universe that came from nothing and was caused by nothing, all human beings, all living things, regardless their level of development or cognitive ability, are cosmic accidents. And this is the point you draw out so well in your books, Frank, that they have to borrow from our worldview to even get their objection off the ground. And what I try to do is I'll listen to see if I need to go there with that person. Not everybody needs to go to that metaphysical foundational level, but a lot of people do, and you better be equipped to do it. And I don't mean to turn this into a publicity stunt for you, Frank, but your two books are the best two sources to get a handle on those ultimate foundational questions.
Well, thanks, brother. And by the way, we are going to be teaching Stealing from God next week online, or next month, I should say. And there's an early bird special. You guys can get in cheaper if you sign up before Wednesday night. So go to crossexamine.org, click on online courses. But Scott, tell people where they can get your well, sorry, I want to do three things quickly here with you. How can people get involved if they want to get more involved in the pro-life movement? Number one, what website do they go to learn more about what you're doing? And thirdly, just end it with hope for people that have had an abortion. Go ahead.
Well, if they want to reach me, prolifetraining.com, pro-life training, all one word, lowercase will do, prolifetraining.com. There's a link on there called The Case for Life that will summarize that syllogism, explain it, and defend it philosophically and scientifically. If they want to get involved, let me give you the first three things you need to do. Step number one, you need to master the moral logic of the pro-life view. Mm-hmm. And I'm only going to give you 3 books to do that. My book, The Case for Life, Peter Kreff's book, The Unaborted Socrates, a very quick read that's hilarious and fun. It's a debate, imaginary debate between an abortionist, a moral relativist, and Socrates, who is pro-life in this book. And then I also recommend that you pick up Frank Beckwith's book, Defending Life. Just those 3 books, which in the series of a couple of months, you could master and have a real handle on this issue and be able to engage people. Secondly, your local crisis pregnancy centers need your help. You need to be supporting them with your money and with your volunteer efforts. Third thing you need to do, you need to start talking about this issue. Don't buy the lie that only the professionals like Frank and I should be out there talking. No, we are all apologists now. We are part of a culture that fundamentally believes the Christian worldview is dangerous and intolerant, and millions of our fellow citizens have absorbed that view. We've got to turn that around, and being gracious and intelligent ambassadors for Jesus Christ will help us do that. If there's anybody listening to us right now and you've had an experience with abortion, I want you to keep this fundamental principle in mind, and I'm going to give it to you in a sentence. Here it is. Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners. That's you. That's me. I'm the worst sinner I know, and you're probably the worst sinner you know. And all of us have a desperate need for someone to give us the righteousness we don't have. You don't need an excuse for a past abortion. You need an exchange, Christ's righteousness for your sinfulness. And the beauty of Scripture is you can have that righteousness, not because of anything you've mustered up, but because of what Jesus did standing in your place as your substitute, as your advocate, when he bore in full on the cross the judgment for your sin. So that's the message of hope. Not what you do, but what Christ did for you.
Father, I pray if there's anyone out there who has not accepted that message, who hasn't repented of their sin, whether it's abortion or anything else, that today would be the day. That's our ultimate hope in Jesus, nothing else. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, God. Thank you, Jorge. See you guys.
Thank you, fellas. Well, tomorrow, Frank, we have a few more, and we'll do this all over again.
We'll have Dr. Dan Eichenberger on to talk about the medical impact of coronavirus. Then on Wednesday, we'll have Gary Habermas, and on Thursday, we'll have Greg Kokel. Thank you so much, Scott.
Thank you, guys.
God bless.